It's always a pleasure to introduce our speaker every month, our interviewee. But today it's a special pleasure for me because I have known Nathaniel Altman for 52 years. We met when we were both working at the Theosophical Society in America. And at that time, when there was an able-bodied young man on staff, they put him on the grounds crew. So that was what Nathaniel was doing. And I was working in the library. So at night, Nathaniel would be up in his room, way up on the top floor. They put the young man up there too, and creating his book, which turned out to be Eating for Life, the first book, as far as I know, on vegetarianism to be published in the US in the 20th century. So he would bring his chapter down to me in the library, where I had a fancy state-of-the-art electric typewriter, and I would retype the chapter and make it pretty. And I was thinking, gosh, I wonder if I could ever write a book. Well, fast forward, I've done 13, and my mentor, Nathaniel, I believe is at 27 and counting. So welcome, my friend and teacher, Nathaniel Altman.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Victoria. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's wonderful. And you are still, after these many years, a Theosophist. So for those who don't know what that is, please give us a little tutorial on Theosophy.
Theosophy it's called the wisdom religion. And I have something I could read very short thing of a statement that was recently published. It said that the bond of students of Theosophy is not a profession or belief or common belief, but a search and aspiration for truth. They hold the truth should be sought by study, by reflection, by purity of life, devotion to high ideals, and they regard truth as a prize to be striven for, not as a dogma. And one of the things that attracted me mostly to the Theosophical Society back in, I think, 1970, when I became a member, was the universality, the acceptance of people from all backgrounds, different religions, different races, equality of people of all genders. And recently, there's been an evolution in the Theosophical Society regarding Ahimsa, which impressed me a lot. The Theosophical Society is made up of branches around the world. And I think there may be 40 or 50 something different national organizations. And the one in the United States, which Victoria and I, we worked at the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in America, recently has a platform promoting Ahimsa as the essence of Theosophy.
Wow.
And for me, this is kind of interesting because many years ago, and I believe you remember when Jeffrey Hodson visited Alcott, which is the headquarters, and he's basically known as a clairvoyant, as a mystic, but he was very, very interested in compassion and nonviolence, and he was one of the earliest promoters of vegetarianism. And he started writing about Ahimsa in the 1940s, which I didn't know about until recently. But I remember that I met him at Alcott, as you did, and later I spent time with him at the Crotona Institute of Theosophy in California. And I was able to have some private meetings with him. And many people in the Theosophical Society study esoteric religion and the history of the human race that goes back millions of years. And I was never really into that. I kind of like the idea of the unity of life and what we can do to make the world better now. And I kind of told him that I just don't understand a lot of what people are talking about. And he said, Nathaniel, you need to understand that Ahimsa is the essence of Theosophy, the essence of divine wisdom, and the importance of doing our best every day to promote peace and compassion. And I was very moved by that, and I've always remembered his teaching.
This is really fascinating to me. Reverend William and I were talking this morning about the far-sightedness of even the very early Theosophists back in the 1800s to think about the oneness of all people and all life that long ago was quite extraordinary. And I know that some of the early Theosophists had difficulties that were not unlike the kinds of problems that people are running into again today. I think of one of the founders, Annie Besant, who lost her children in a divorce. And there were problems. People had a hard time in the 1870s and in the 2020s accepting people seeing life a little bit differently. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those pioneers and the history?
I'm not an expert in theosophical history, but one of the leaders, the early founders, was Madame Helena Blavatsky. And she was a very independent woman. She's actually the first Russian citizen to become an American citizen. And she had traveled by herself into the Himalayas. And the story is that she met highly evolved people who were known as the masters of the wisdom. And they chose her to organize an organization or start an organization that promoted universal kinship of humanity and the study of the deeper sides of all the religions in the world, because the idea is that all of the religions share on a deeper level a certain commonality. So this organization was one of the first ever to accept and promote the unity of people from all different religions in the world, as well as races, because of course, discrimination has been going on and racism has been going on for millennia. But this is the first organization, for example, to accept low caste Hindus as members and see everyone as equal and equally due respect and to be listened to and to become friends with. And Madame Blavatsky was one of the first people to do this, and other people she was involved with, for example, a man named Henry Steele Olcott, who was a Civil War colonel. And he later wound up bringing Buddhism right back to Sri Lanka, which is used to be Ceylon. And there's statues of him having promoted Buddhism and brought it back to a mainstream life there. So it was an interesting group. And if you go to the headquarters in Adyar in Madras, India, they have shrines and temples of many of the major world religions. And the Dalai Lama actually visited Adyar back in 1956. And he mentioned that this was the first time he was exposed to people with a pluralism, I think it's called pluralism of belief and study in different religions. And he was, of course, only exposed to Tibetan Buddhism. And he said, this is the first time I was really in contact with people who are Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus. And he said it changed his whole perspective of life. And what interested me, which I found out recently, do you remember Edwin Lord, who was the—
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Edward and Marcella Lord.
Yeah.
He became very close to the Dalai Lama in the 50s when the Dalai Lama was like a young man. And he was the one who was instrumental in bringing him to the Theosophical headquarters in Adyar. And we used to eat dinner with Edwin and his wife, but he was very modest and he never really talked about his background. And he really changed, his connection with the Dalai Lama really changed the Dalai Lama's perspective on the world, which in turn has changed the way that Tibetan Buddhism is understood in the world.
Wow, I love the connections. And when the Dalai Lama came to Olcott, when we were working there, along with a lot of other incredible people. So I love it that Ahimsa is now seen as the essence of Theosophy. And I really believe that you have a lot to do with that, because I have seen you as a champion of Ahimsa from the first time I ever met you. I remember when you were researching that first book on vegetarianism, you went to a slaughterhouse. Now, we all know about undercover investigators and that nowadays, but this was the early 1970s. So what drew Ahimsa into your consciousness and your awareness?
It's hard to say. I think that in my life, and I have to admit this, I've had a lot of violent, non-ahimsa tendencies. And these were things that maybe if we talk about reincarnation in a past life, I may well have been a person who expressed a great deal of cruelty. And I think in this life, I've been striving for a life of ahimsa and promoting it. I remember as a kid, I used to be terrified if I ever saw anyone who was missing a limb. For example, an amputee, I used to be absolutely, I would react to such a strong point, I would have to leave. And many years ago, I've always met a lot of people who are psychic, and one of them did talk to me about a past life and said, in the last life, you were a samurai in Japan. I've always felt a very strong connection to Japan. He said, you were involved in a great deal of cruelty, and you were involved in killing quite a few people. And he said, this is why in this life, you've been very interested in nonviolence and peace and compassion. And that really fit. That made sense to me. And I still am aware of it. I know that, one of the challenges that I think a lot of us are dealing with these days is with COVID. A lot of people have been traumatized, and a lot of people have been behaving in ways that we normally would not. I think there's a lot more anger, a lot more frustration, a lot more selfishness. And it's been really a challenge to try to meet that in our everyday life, to try to express compassion and understanding towards other people and also towards ourselves. And these days, I think for me, the last couple of years have been that kind of a challenge.
So, Nathaniel, one of my favorites of your books, and I have a lot of favorites. You guys, if you don't know Nathaniel's work, you must look him up, because he is truly a Renaissance author, and he has studied so many areas. He's got the ahimsa and nonviolence, all kinds of holistic health topics, palmistry, and some other kinds of psychic issues. There's a wealth of wonderful information in his books. But one of your very favorites of mine is the Nonviolent Revolution. And as I look at the world around us now, and I realize everything is changing, nothing stays the same, but just looking at what we see in the present moment, where would a nonviolent revolution fit in, and is one possible?
This is a very good question. I think we have no choice. If we give into the violence in the world and the lying, the constant manipulation, the lying, the commercialism, this promotion of the consumer society, I think this all leads to destruction. We're very much aware, and I know that some of the people here have studied the impact on consumerism and working, dealing with other animals and how they don't survive, the fact that this is destroying the environment. We have to do what we can in our own ways to promote a nonviolent type of living and a real understanding of other lives. One of my favorite books is actually one I wrote called Sacred Trees. And I spent months traveling around the world and visiting ancient forests. And I feel that we could communicate with trees similarly as we communicate with other animals. And by really trying to understand them, we will learn from them. And I did this with trees, and I learned a great deal about how we need to really expand our compassion to flowers and trees and animals and bees and certainly individual other people. And I think that's really probably the beginning, is the other people, but not limit ourselves in any way. And of course, each of us is going to have our own focus, things that we feel more inclined to be involved with. Some people work very well with gardens. And I think you remember there were several people at the Theosophical headquarters who were master gardeners. I'm thinking of our friend Charlie Sass, who used to take care of the plants. And he did it in a very quiet way, you know, but that was his way of expressing love and compassion towards life. And other people were involved in other types of activities. And one of the old theosophical, not a dogma, but one of the statements is together differently, to work together differently in our own way to work toward the same goal, and understanding that everyone is not going to do the same thing. You know, there were some people, for example, at Alcott, at the headquarters, who are not vegetarian by nature. And I'm thinking one of a woman who was involved in cleaning she was the head housekeeper, Robertina, and she was a meat eater. Yet she was one of the most spiritual, the most generous people I ever met. And you remember Maddie and Bob Gephardt when their apartment was in a fire and they lost everything, absolutely everything. And many people were saying, well, if we could do anything, we'll be happy to help. You know, please call on us. And what she did is she went right up to Maddie Louise, gave her $300 in cash, turned around and left, because she knew exactly what was needed. And I remember once when I was in California, I was really broke at the time. And she used to make fun of our diets because we would have a lot of meat that was like gluten and soy. She referred to it as rubber heels. And I remember that when I was out in Ojai, I once got a letter from her and I had like $30 in the bank or something like that. I was really broke. And she enclosed a $50 bill and said, buy yourself some rubber heels. And it's such an act of pure generosity. And that too has a very strong spiritual root. The idea of doing what's appropriate to help other people, and of course, animals and plants, and of course, the environment in general. So I kind of like that holistic view, and also the idea of understanding that people are going to be working differently, and everyone should be supported towards that.
I love that. I never heard that, together differently. Of all the times when we could use that teaching, I think right about now.
That was George Arundel came up with that, who was Rukmini Devi's husband.
Yes. Wow.
He was a big promoter of vegetarianism. I remember she was very active in the vegetarian societies, the International Vegetarian Societies, and the Indian vegetarian movement as well.
Yes. For people who don't know, Rukmini was a very famous Indian dancer. And she tells the story of when she was in the States, that everybody wanted to regale her with all this food and all these big meals with many courses. And she was so eager to get back to India and her simple diet. And she was lacto-vegetarian, not vegan. And she tells the story that she was invited at the very end of her trip for an impromptu luncheon by Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was just thinking, oh no, another one of these big, awful, heavy lunches. Okay, you can't say no to the first lady. They had cottage cheese and fruit. And she always talked about that as such a wonderful memory of being in the United States. So just as our time comes to a close, this is always seems so fast to me. Many people in our generation have tried lots of spiritual paths, and you have stuck with this one. So I just want to know, as the final kind of statement, how has Theosophy grown with you, and how have you grown with it? And just what does your life look like, a day in the life of a Theosophist?
Well, I can't say that I represent any typical Theosophist, because one of the things, as you well know, and you've met many when you were at the headquarters and during convention, the people in the Theosophical Society are vastly different, of all professions, all different kinds of beliefs. I think my life is very similar to what yours would be, or many other people. You know, we wake up in the morning and say, well, what can I do to make the world a better place? And what I try to do is in the morning, just to focus on, I know that when I go out of the house and when I interact with other people, especially these days, I think the most important thing is to be friendly, be sensitive, be open, and make people feel a little bit better. Because I think a lot of people are traumatized, people are unhappy. And it's also important for me also to take time to relax, time to reflect. I try to get out in nature every single day. Like after this lovely meeting, I'm planning to take a walk in Valley Stream State Park in Long Island, which is a very beautiful park. They've got wonderful ducks, and the new ducklings have just been born. And it's a very beautiful place to just walk. And I really suggest and recommend that everybody's day should include time in nature, and especially interacting with the trees and the plants and the flowers, because I do believe that all life is sentient and that we can communicate and learn from other forms of life. And they also learn from us. I found that when I was doing my work with the trees in Latin America and in California, they often like to learn from us because we're mobile and move around, whereas they stay in one place. So there's a certain affinity between humans and trees, humans and flowers, humans and other plants. And I think that's very important to focus on.
Well, that's so beautiful. And how wonderful today that we're talking with farmers. So thank you so much, Nathaniel.
Thank
and
you,
we'll
Victoria.
pass it on to Reverend Erica, Kimmy, and Carano.